So I think the goal of digital transformation is one that has become more shared by governments around the world. So there's a growing interest in figuring out how are you going to reorganize government using technology. Where I think the trend that I think is most interesting is there seems to be two camps emerging. So one is in wealthier countries where there is more infrastructure that's already been put in place, there's a real struggle of how are we going to change all this infrastructure, how are we going to change our business processes to adapt to this new world. Whereas in the emerging markets, there's a recognition that since there's less infrastructure built, like fewer computer systems, there's fewer services already offered, there's a huge opportunity to build things and kind of leapfrog and kind of build next generation services from scratch. And so those are two trends. I think the established countries are wrestling with how we're going to make this transformation, and the new countries see a real opportunity for them to advance and maybe surpass what's offered in say like the OECD countries. Well, I think there's two things going on. So one is, I mentioned before, there's countries that don't have as formal government institutions built because they're emerging markets, so they haven't had the resources. So there's what we call greenfield. They get to build from scratch. It's a huge advantage versus the countries that are established. Now, just who have already built all sorts of infrastructure and systems, on legacy software, it's going to be very, very hard to change. Now, it just so happens that it also happens to coincide with who is wealthy and who tends to be less wealthy or has emergent wealth. That said, one of the things I've really observed is that organizations that have less resources need to be more innovative. So, when you have a lot of money, you can kind of afford to keep doing a practice that's expensive or doesn't make sense because you have a lot of resources to kind of just basically throw at the problem. So when I look at a country like Estonia, when in the 1980s and 1990s, you might have thought they were going to simply rebuild themselves in the model of a classic European state, but they didn't feel like they had the resources to do that. So it compelled them to rethink things, and that's kind of what led to the Estonian model. So if they'd been wealthier, I don't know that they would have made the choices they would have made. The fact that they had fewer resources meant they had to be innovative and try new things. And so there's often a real advantage to having less resources, and that you're more open to innovation and trying what I think is kind of on the edge of what's possible. So I think there's a few things about Greece that are really interesting to me. One is it is a country that has had financial challenges over the last decade, and I think a lot of people see that as a source of weakness, and I actually think that that can be a source of strength. It can give you the opportunity to go and make investments and to do things that I think have been proven out in other sectors, but are not perceived as the way things get done in government, but that are cheaper and more effective. And it can be a forcing function to bring in best practices that have been proven in other organizations. And so this is actually potentially a source of strength that I think is not often realized. The second thing is, I would say, I was very impressed. I ask people to talk about failures, and there's a lot of contexts where I will go and engage with stakeholders and say, let's go talk about failures. And everybody's keen to say that there are failures, but nobody wants to talk about the failures that they've personally been involved in, things that didn't work, lessons they had to learn. And here was a group where people talked openly. They're like, I was on this project, it didn't work out the way I'd like. And then they talked about what they learned. That's the most important thing. Did you learn something, and can you bring that forward into the next thing that you do? And people are willing to talk openly and candidly about that. And that suggests to me, like, that's the hardest part of a culture to build, and in that room that existed. So that suggests a lot of hope for me. I wrote an article a little while ago about how I didn't want governments to be kind of on the cutting edge innovators. I want governments. I don't want governments to use the newest and latest things, because that often involves an enormous amount of risk, and the private sector is much better at figuring out how to absorb that risk, and many companies die because they try newest things and they don't work out. What I would like for governments to become are what I would call fast followers. So to identify technologies, processes, methodologies, practices that have been borne out that work in other organizations that we've seen work for 5 or 10 years. So there's a clear demonstration that it was not a fad. There's a clear demonstration that it has achieved success, and then to adopt them very, very quickly once they've been proven out in other places and other contexts. And I think one of the struggles I have right now with governments is often it takes decades for us to start to absorb a best practice that appears elsewhere and to really drive it into the organization. So maybe one of the roles for think tanks is to help governments identify these best practices that have been de-risked in other sectors and to bring them into government more quickly. And so I want governments that can adapt and can be more agile and can use new services. It's just that they need to use services, I think, that have been de-risked.